Lord God Almighty, Heavenly Father, we thank you for establishing your church among us, where your word is taught, the gospel is preached, the sacraments administered, and all of us are blessed. We thank you for making us, letting us share in the ministry of reconciliation by preaching the gospel within these walls and without. Bless our discussions this morning as we direct our hearts and minds toward the future and continuation of our school. Give us insight and wisdom from your word, wise insight from your experienced soldiers of the gospel. Help us all to speak with love, patience, kindness, and the awareness that we are all after the same thing, your glory, your will, and the good of the church. We ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. Is this picking up? You can hear me all right? Some yeses, some nos. Maybe that's your end. You got to turn up. Better? Closer in the mouth? Okay, so I got to talk louder, but you are picking me up for the computer's sake. All right. Morning, everybody. I'm going to start with some thank yous, just so I don't forget them. There's a lot of work and effort that's been put in for this committee report, and I want to make sure that I thank, first of all of the committee members. Throughout this summer and into late spring, we've been working pretty tirelessly on the report and gathering information and data. We've also had a series of interviews, and we're going to talk about kind of the information from our school and from Jody and the office. So I just want to start first and foremost with a thank you for everybody that's put in a ton of energy and effort in putting forth what we believe is a very comprehensive, prayerful consideration of what Heritage and where we're at with our school. So thank you again for the committee members and everybody that's been involved in this. We have a ton of information to get through. Again, this is kind of a new format in that we are not presenting necessarily the final vote for said considerations for the school, but we are trying to give as much information as we can today, as well as we'll give supplemental information that you can access and a pathway to answer more questions in between. But we want to give you time to deliberate on this and prayerfully consider the information, and we'll be back together in a couple weeks where we'll kind of have an official vote, and we'll talk more about the logistics of that plan moving forward. But general kind of review, these are your committee members. We have been meeting since I think March, April timeline. At least monthly, if not every other week, we've been meeting, really trying to pour over this information, pour over the really the deep consideration of kind of where is Heritage Lutheran Church and School and what is the future ministry. So these are the members that have kind of a sampling of current and former council members, school board members, properties, obviously pastor. So we wanted to get a pretty deep dive on kind of all the important voices that are here at Heritage. Again, most of this is, all of this is review. You guys know how we got here. The background is Heritage Lutheran School has been an early childhood center with preschool and with kindergarten for a long time. When Mrs. Smith retired, kind of a turning point in our educational ministry here. And so we did pause on the kindergarten, and that gave us and this committee that opportunity to review and kind of think through what are the next steps in reevaluating the school ministry here at Heritage. And that's where this subcommittee has been formed and has been pondering these issues. Also, through this up there, this is just the statement of the philosophy of education from our ELS schools. The committee also did look at and connect with the director of schools from the ELS and from their synod, because we're, again, trying to understand not just our own ministry here, but how that fits in within our synodical fellowship, and what is the general philosophy and purpose of education, to raise up and give instruction in the Lord, to raise children both within our community and within our own homes, to know and fear the Lord and trust in Him. And similarly, this is also right off of our website from the Heritage School, kind of the purpose and instruction to train a child in the way that they should go. I think we all know that that is what our purpose and our value is here in the education at Heritage, is to instruct and raise the lambs in their understanding of who their Savior is. All right, so with that, obviously as the backdrop and kind of why we even have a school, I'm going to give a little bit of overview of specifically what work has been completed, and then I'm going to walk you through kind of some of the most kind of salient variables that we looked at, as far as, I think, driving influences or key markers about kind of a decision that we need to come to as far as the future of Heritage School. So work that's been completed, this committee interviewed school staff, as I mentioned, not just one round of interviews with the teachers and faculty, but we actually came back to them a second time, getting additional information, many hours that they spent, and not just the full-time faculty and staff, but also part-time teachers' aides, the office staff. We really wanted to get as much information from them as possible. We discussed with the ELS director of Lutheran schools, had a few back and forth interviews and information with Shu Ting Lai, who gave us a kind of a unique perspective in that we are pretty unique here at Heritage, in that we have kind of this school that has been a preschool and kindergarten. And so he gave us some guidance and information about kind of what steps he would or synodically might recommend for us. Discussion with a lot of different church and schools in our fellowship, survey of class sizes among other preschools in our fellowship, interview and assessment with the current faculty in regards to potential opportunities or challenges with expansion. And that's one of the things, a takeaway that I had from this too, is that this is not the first time that Heritage has considered this. And so even kind of thinking through kind of the different eras and what might be different or the similar as far as why Heritage School would be considering and what is next. We looked at the analysis of the historical enrollment. I'll give you some of those slides in a minute. Really wanted to know and understand how many students we've been serving and what is the true number of families, both partial and full-time enrollment, to kind of really understand how that overlaps with the financial numbers. Phil's going to come up here and give you a really in-depth study of the financial information historically and how that also maps out with some modeling looking forward. We tried to put together several different scenarios of models for a 5-year forecast for different options for what could or should happen as far as moving forward for Heritage. One of the other things that I think is really valuable that we did, District President Klatt, who's the Wisconsin Synod, Minnesota District President, and also a pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran in New Hope. We did a pretty in-depth review, interview, and case study with Pastor Klatt as far as a potential kind of market analysis or a comparative analysis of their church and school and kind of how they, over the last 10 to 15 years, have grown from a preschool to now a preschool to an 8th grade full elementary Lutheran school. So you're going to hear from Dave as he kind of talks through kind of a comparative analysis and what lessons were learned in interviewing with Pastor Klatt. And then we also collected input from you. The last bit of information, it may be in that survey that was sent out. We sent surveys out to all the Heritage members, as well as the school, alumni, and the current school to gather more information about enrollment, about tuition price setting, and about kind of the future if there were expansion of grades. So now I'm going to jump into some of those variables. So tuition analysis, and we kind of already talked about this when we had our preliminary report, I think at the voters meeting, that we knew, and as we started to assess kind of the tuition rates of Heritage, a couple of takeaways is that Heritage has always tried to be very competitive, and maybe so much so competitive that they try to be very individualized for the families, to kind of meet exactly what the families want to be served as far as 2 to 3 day enrollment or preschool, extended day. There's lots of different options for how to enroll here at Heritage. So what we wanted to do is to be able to understand how does that tuition rate, and so it's not just as easy as making up a phone call to the local other schools to say, how does our tuition, because we have to do all of the different finagling with how many different days and extended day. But this chart kind of gives a pretty good analysis of it, because it does show in the box that's highlighted, you'll see Heritage school only. So for preschool, full day, and kindergarten, full day. And then you also have the extended day, which is kind of the two, not just to essentially 3 o'clock, but all the way to the end of 5 o'clock. And that, if I'm right, Mr. Phil, is different in comparison to what you see on our competitive market over here, because that is just for tuition for enrollment in the school. So at a quick glance, you can see that we are below the benchmark as far as our competitors on pricing. We have tried to be very value add as far as not being over priced, but we've probably fallen quite a bit behind the competitors' market as far as tuition price rating set. So we're below that, and there is some additional room for tuition rate increases. I also asked the same question as far as the sensitivity to our consumers, asking you as well as the school and alumni, kind of what is the best philosophy for tuition setting. Over 75% said tuition should be essentially as high as necessary to ensure quality and on par with competitors in market. So statistically on that survey that was sent out, the general trend was we should be on par with the rest of the market as far as tuition. Probably too deep a dive, but what we did also is we asked, again, those 3 different surveys that were sent out to give an estimate of what they thought the pricing should be at. And this is a statistical analysis for kind of gauging a price setting philosophy, where you ask the consumer, what is the price that's too low, where you are essentially questioning the quality or the integrity of the product? What is a good value? What is starting to get more expensive but you would still enroll? And then what is too high, or that you would, the pricing is too high and you wouldn't even consider utilizing that service. So this is a philosophy of kind of how to research and assess the tuition rate that we gave in that survey. So you can see if it was too low, the mean or average rate was $3,600. Still a good value was $4,600. And at what price would you consider the tuition slightly expensive, but still would consider enrolling, is about $6,400. So even within our analysis of the surveys of current students, alumni, and members here, there was a general understanding that tuition can go up. We already kind of came to you with that in June, but this is one of the main takeaways that I want you to hear this morning, is that through our analysis, we do believe that tuition can increase, that there's a significant percentage to be able to be on par with our competitors, and that even as we have looked and studied the trends within our competitors, we're going to potentially have to be pretty aggressive on how we increase tuition if the general idea is we want to be relatively on par or on market with others. We are pretty far behind, and they are increasing 8 to 9, 10% every year annually too. So we don't have in front of you like, here's exactly how we will get to an increased on par competition for the tuition analysis, but we know that we need to get there. We know that we need to over the next several years increase tuition, and that's kind of one key variable in this analysis. Next thing that we looked at is enrollment. Very hard graph to look at, but by putting this up here just because And I don't see Jesse in here, but Jesse, working with Jody, worked really hard on kind of information with gathering all of the historical enrollment trends that we have had with preschool and kindergarten here at Heritage, to really dig in and understand what students have we served, how many different, again, individualized options, but what are the total families? Because we really wanted to know, how does that overlap and compare, obviously with the financial information and with a projection, and really having a solid foundation and understanding of what can we predict or anticipate with trends in enrollment. This is probably one of the, again, more important slides, because it does show, I think, well, maybe different. This one will show it a little differently. The full-time enrollment is what we basically were able to try to draw out from the statistical analyses of understanding how many students have been enrolled, but essentially if we are billing out the tuition cost for a full day enrollment or a partial day enrollment, we want to be able to understand, again, what is essentially the generated income from the student in order to be able to be good stewards about how does that balance off with our cost for property and cost for salaries and such. As you can see from this, there's the blue line is the kindergarten enrollment. I think we all know, and we've all kind of sensed within the COVID era and within kind of the recognition over the last several years about challenges within the public school system, there has been increased interest in our market nationally, locally, in the idea of non-public school education. And we saw that with our kindergarten enrollment going up. Probably on this slide you'll also notice preschool is the orange one, kind of more stable or flat-lined. There's some ups and downs in that, but not necessarily the same upward trajectory that we had with kindergarten over the last 5 years or so. I think that was news to me as far as information about the enrollment trends, is that we probably, when you're looking at full-time headcount, that we were kind of gaining or growing in our enrollment in kindergarten right before we paused that. And that is probably in some ways unfortunate that we did have this pause, because it was trending in the right way and being very potentially positive as far as the financial impact on that too. So we looked at also some enrollment information from our competitors, again trying to understand what their enrollment looks like in the early childhood centers, to be able to understand a good balance of what does the student to teacher ratio, how does that mix look like in other classrooms and such. So Crown of Life is the one example that we compared and looked at how many different students are in the classroom, what is the mix that they use between licensed or called teachers and teachers' aides. Also looked at kind of their same kind of understanding of how much flexibility or independent enrollment options. Did the same thing with King of Grace and their preschool program. King of Grace is licensed for up to 36 students, similar that what we kind of heard from interviews of our staff, we want to keep smaller class sizes. And that's kind of consistent, I think, within a lot of our fellowship schools, is they want to have that smaller environment where they can have more of that nurturing and ministry to the individual students and to the families. But they currently have 20 students, 2 teachers' aides, 2 teachers and 2 teachers' aides, and they utilize when they're below ratio. Also, on the enrollment question, we surveyed again, does your family, I think this is a really important finding from the survey, because again, we wanted to gauge what is the potential interest for our families and for those families that we've served in the school if we did continue enrollment. So we asked essentially the same question across those 3 different surveys. Does your family have interest in potential enrollment for Christian education at Heritage? 29 families from those surveys said yes. Now that is a pretty notable number. Again, does that mean that all of them have sent in their tuition check? No. But it does show that there's an interest without even doing kind of a further extension of marketing or kind of PR out in the community. We have 29 families immediately on our communication list that have shown that interest in Christian education here at Heritage. So final findings from this enrollment analysis. Our market competitors use a higher rate of teachers' aides than we do. They likely are able to increase the amount of students enrolled because of ratios between teachers and teachers' aides. So within those competitors, we saw that they were able to likely increase the amount of students served and obviously the potential tuition or budgetary impact if they are utilizing higher student ratios with teachers' aides. Another key finding that kindergarten was increasing in student enrollment. That was a positive trajectory. And that there is a potential for increases in enrollment from the survey. I think that, again, underscores that there's a need, there's a desire. We have a ton of articles and information that the committee looked at as far as national trends about why non-public school enrollment has increased, why that statistically has increased within our Wisconsin Synod sister schools, but even just very, very concentrated on a local level, our surveys show that there is an interest and that there is a draw for more Christian education. Heritage did increase that. Did you want to take this, Phil, or you want me to? I can. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. Take this. Check. You guys hear me all right? Yeah? Okay. So there's a lot of numbers on this page. I'm going to try to hone in on a couple specifically. So part of the reason we're here historically, we know that Heritage has not necessarily kept up with teacher compensation according to the full Synod scale. That Synod scale essentially is what's represented with this matrix. So for teachers, depending on your level of education, the Synod recommends somewhere between these red lines on the picture. So I'm going to focus on one specific year just to make it simple. So say you are a 20-year teacher. The Synod recommends, depending on your education level, between $40,819 and $46,941. Heritage has not necessarily kept up with this range over our history. As of this year, we have enacted essentially the high level of the Synod-based scale. So we are at, in the equivalent of this example, for a 20-year teacher, for a full-time equivalent of 1.0, $46,941. So we are there at least for the base salary component right now, have not been historically, and I think this is an important thing to note in kind of understanding the entire compensation package as well. So other components of compensation, which the Synod recommends, which we have not included historically, are health insurance and housing allowance. Now, as we got into the details of this, and as we interviewed other schools, the application of this varies pretty widely. So I saw through multiple interviews with both kind of local here and further out in rural Minnesota, offerings varying from nothing for health insurance up to a theoretical, well, the theoretical maximum in this would be a full family, so $24.48 per month times 12, that's $30,000. So I saw actually in interviews ranges from $0 to $26,000 among various different schools. This one's also a little bit complicated because not everyone elects healthcare, which is part of why many of them I saw $0. And it makes it slightly challenging to predict, but saw anywhere from in that range from 0 to 26. I don't know that I'd necessarily say there was a clear consensus in approach. Some had it, some didn't. The other component is housing allowance, which the Synod essentially recommends you to use some form of the HUD market for your area, rent. So that application can be anywhere from essentially, $932 a month. We'll say that's $11,000 annually to $2,145 per month, which would be $26,000 annually. So theoretically, somewhere between $11,000 and $26,000. As I was interviewing other schools as well, a pretty common approach I saw was about $1,000 a month for housing allowance, so that's $12,000 annually. There was some variation in that, but a lot less. So I would say pretty typically we saw roughly a $12,000 annual stipend for that. And I guess I should just clarify a little further there. So that's really the components of salary that we're missing right now, and that we'd need to work on in any scenario, whether we continue with just preschool or continue with some form of grade expansion. We have to solve for that in one way or another, regardless of the situation. And we'll go through that in a little more detail in the financial slides.
Yeah, so that's the main key takeaway here on the variable regarding salary, is that historically we probably have been behind on all three components within a comprehensive package of compensation for teachers and faculty. We have aligned and gotten that one step of the base salary where we are on par and on the high end of that matrix for the Synod scale. So we have made right on that one component. With regards to any future calls, we want to make sure that all three components are where they need to be in order to have this be an attractive position, and to be in comparison with any other Synod school. And not just moving forward, but we want to make that right with the current faculty as well. So as changes and in the future years, we are trying to make all three components of that right for our salaries. The next one is the financials, so Phil's going to stay right here too.
Okay, so there is a lot to digest with these upcoming slides. I think this one is probably one especially that you want to kind of take home, digest a little more in the details. But for right now, I'm going to keep it pretty focused on some specific components of how we went about modeling various different scenarios, some of the principles we used, and what the results of that showed. So I'm just going to call out a couple of the kind of critical assumptions that we used in modeling. So all scenarios included an assumption that a housing allowance and insurance benefit was added to the teacher. So whether that's continuation of pre-K up through grade expansions, in every scenario, we included an increase for housing allowance and health insurance. All scenarios also included an assumption of a material increase in tuition. The primary reason being there, if we're going to add in housing allowance and insurance, we'd have to figure out some way to pay for that. So, and we believe strongly through the market analysis that opportunity is there. So all of those scenarios include essentially a material increase soon in tuition, with then modest but continued increases in coming years. And then just I think one of the key things to consider in this as well is we had various different grade expansion scenarios, classrooms, physical classrooms, and the amount of students you have in a physical classroom with a teacher is very, very important in this financial analysis. So I just want to highlight quickly, in our different scenarios, pre-K only, 2 classrooms, pre-K through K, 3 classrooms, pre-K through 2nd grade, 3 classrooms, pre-K through 5th, 4 classrooms. So essentially these first 3 scenarios are, utilizing the physical space that we have utilized and had historically. Pre-K through 5th starts to get into the idea of some expansion and capital investment. All right. So lots of numbers here, but I think just to orient you with kind of what this is showing, they're essentially our full financial statements with variably modeled assumptions behind this, but just condensing it into something that you can hopefully see. We essentially have what our school looks like today. This is the actual budget that we put forward for the current school year. After looking at actual enrollees and our tuition assumptions, I think this is a relatively good predictor of where we're going to end this year under our new salary model. And then essentially I have modeled out here in the following 5 years new tuition amounts. So this is the rough gross tuition that we're using in the assumptions. What the impact of that tuition is to revenue specifically, what the impact of our benefit decisions would add to teacher cost, and then overall just what are the overall financials. And red means we're in the negative, green means we're in the positive. So this is the pre-K scenario. Essentially, and you can flip back to your FTE enrollment page just to look at these types of things, but we have averaged over our last 10 years, it's roughly 21 students. This year we're roughly 20, and I'm talking in this scenario full-time equivalent students. So if you're here 3 days a week, you're actually a 0.6 FTE. We're not including that as a full student. So essentially, I'm modeling flat FTE enrollment, which it is basically saying we should continue our trend in preschool enrollment. In that scenario, we essentially would. It's somewhat maybe draconian to say this, but the model would pretty much show that we're likely never going to be able to have an independent school that can be self-sustaining. That's not necessarily the goal, but it is definitely something that we evaluated and considered in the different models. So essentially, under this model, we would essentially be continuing to accumulate losses in perpetuity, and that would eat into church reserves. All right. So this is the pre-K plus K. So this would be what I call the return to where we were model. Essentially modeled the flat 20 FTE enrollment, and then a rebound to where we started to see enrollment trending over the past few years. So this essentially gets to, by 5 years, 20 FTE students in preschool, 15 in kindergarten. That produces, these are all the same tuition assumptions in all these models as well. Essentially that would get us to a break even by year 4. And we would start to have a modest profit in the school, hopefully going forward. That would essentially eat into reserves by about $70,000 at the worst point, and then could potentially start accumulating reserves at that time. So more sustainable, still a glide path to getting to that point, but probably not draining church reserves in perpetuity as long as we keep up with tuition. So pre-K through second, which would essentially again be utilizing the same amount of classrooms, gets to break even in year 3, and actually by year 5 cumulatively would contribute, and this is assuming a little greater rise in enrollment, just under the assumption we have been able to get close to, the 15 student range with just the kindergarten historically. If we're expanding into the same classroom with more grades, we would potentially be able to ratchet up FTE students even further. So essentially higher revenue with the same cost profile.
Does that make sense? We haven't spent a ton of time talking about kind of that variable, but basically this, and the committee did look at what does a multi-age or multi-grade classroom mean as far as effectiveness on classroom pedagogy and learning. We looked at that, but this is, kindergarten, first and second graders in one classroom, one teacher teaching all 3 levels, being able to kind of split the time between those, and that, similar to what we heard from some of the surveys, that is what some of the families at least would be very interested in as far as continued enrollment and retention of their students for a couple of more years.
I should also highlight one thing I missed. So any scenario from the pre-K, the return to normal, is going to assume some sort of additional teachers. So today we're at 1.5. Moving to these scenarios would assume a call issued at a full-time equivalent teacher to that grade expansion. All right, so the last scenario that we modeled was a pre-K through 5th, and essentially that's continuing again preschool historical enrollment, assuming kindergarten starting to ramp up, and then addition of grades similar to the pre-K through second, where we're able to get up to 20 students in a classroom. And then at the point that we start to hit that enrollment, then layering in another classroom with another called worker attached to it, and then that enrollment also growing over time. So that scenario, we also just assumed that there would be some capital investment. This is a rough estimate at this point in time. We have not spent a ton of time on the capital investment piece of it, but we know there would be some capital investment in getting another classroom up to snuff for a grade expansion beyond that. So that model gets to break even in year 4 and starts to potentially present some higher upside long term. So lots of numbers on that page, lots of things to digest. So what I tried to do to just show the different models against each other is essentially rank them based on different financial metrics. So an example being, how many years does it take to get to break even? Which model is the best? Which model is the worst? So example here, pre-K pre-K to second grade is the quickest to break even. Pre-K only is the longest to break even. So that I would call like a short-term financial metric. Midterm is like a 5-year period. long-term is beyond 5 years, so into perpetuity, and then how much capital, additional cash, would we need to bring those classrooms up to snuff. So I gave each of the scenarios a rank in those categories, and then averaged their performance amongst those categories. And then based on essentially those averages, which are the sum of our categories divided by 4, just ranked overall which model from a kind of objective financial standpoint performs the best to the worst. So in this example, the financial composite only, again, this is not considering strategic aspects, this is just financially evaluating. Pre-K to second was first, pre-K to fifth was second, pre-K and K was third, and pre-K only was fourth. And each has their strengths and weaknesses, as you can see within those metrics. All right, and then some other key takeaways, I think, as we kind of sliced and diced, I think, different financial scenarios ad nauseum. We spent a lot of time on that and landed on those models as the ones we wanted to really evaluate. We highlighted already, but we currently offer essentially the cheapest tuition and the best student-teacher ratio. That model in itself is somewhat in conflict. You don't often see both of those things together. It's kind of the quality and cost conundrum. The higher the quality, generally the higher the cost. So, takeaway there, tuition needs to be higher if we want to be able to continue that model and pay teachers at Synod scale. Second thing that kind of just became like, no matter what way we sliced and diced it, we kind of got back to the same point, is like, in order to have a sustainable model at some point, we need to get 15 FTE students into the classroom. So we were trending there with kindergarten, and I think we need to do that to be able to make these additional investments into compensation. And so then the question that we just kind of kept asking ourselves, and I kept asking myself, is what's the best way to get to 15 students in a classroom? So I think I would ask you to consider that as well as you evaluate the options. Oh, and then the last thing, we actually have a lot of the physical infrastructure already in place to deal with grade expansions. A lot of the things that we looked at and a lot of the people we talked to, that was a way more significant component because they did not necessarily have the physical infrastructure in place. All right, I'm done.
Perfect. Thank you, Phil. Dave, you can start making your way up here. I'm going to just spend a couple minutes on this, kind of some of the things that Phil was just talking about, that we are very blessed as far as our property already here. Our committee started to go down some of those roads of like, well, what would it look like if we did this or this with changes on the property? But a lot of what we kind of landed on was maybe because of all the different variables that we're considering, we shouldn't be investing in kind of too much thought of let's start swinging hammers and kind of building the next property. But there is some of that work, again, has already been done. And those that have been here longer than myself or some of the other committee members know this, but this is the blueprint for when the original renovation was constructed, with the idea that there would be a phase 2 of that construction with additional classrooms this way, I believe. But lots of different variables with all these tuition enrollment and Synod scale, and how do we make this not be overwhelming on as far as a financial subsidy. So a lot of the conclusion on the property piece that the committee landed on was, let's pause on any major capital expansions or any kind of considerations there. Let's see what we can do as far as making kind of conclusions or final thoughts without major changes to the physical property. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk through a Holy Trinity case study, which Dave is going to walk us through.
All right, well, so one of the things that I think we wanted to answer right off the bat is, are we the first people to ever have done this? Or at least recently, or at least in a situation where it's a suburban area. We're not a small farming church now where we're creating a school for, our immediate kids. So has this been done anywhere else? And the answer actually is yes. And in the not so distant past, Holy Trinity and New Hope did this. They started their expansion in 2006. Prior to that, they had a preschool. They also had a daycare. And so we started kind of doing some comparison analysis between the two. And so just a little background on Holy Trinity. Again, they had the daycare and the preschool. They're almost the exact same size as we currently are, or they were in 2006. And then we also looked at some of the area schools. In their case, they were waitlisting kids. I think we can kind of make that same argument today. We've heard some things from Good Shepherd and other schools that, they're pretty close to capacity, if not there already. And then one of their other comments from Pastor Klatt during his interview is that they tend to lose these young families that would join the church, or young couples. They'd have kids, and then at that point they'd transition over to a church that has the school, just because that's where they were spending most of their time anyway. So some other comments on that case study is that they basically had no facilities aside from what was there for their preschool and their daycare. And so when they started to expand, they actually had to start 2 different building projects, the last of which was completed in 2009. As a result, and I'll get to that later, but they actually have a much greater debt load right now comparatively. Now again, they've got the full K-8 facility, but they had to build it all over time. A lot of their growth occurred, you'll see, before 2019, when they finally completed their building. So there was a demand for it, right? People were coming to the school despite not even having first-class facilities. Because their full K-8 school was complete in 2013. And then we had some questions regarding mixed grades, right? Well, what's the community reception to mixed grades? Well, here's a situation, again, suburban, not again farming community, but they've been expanding despite having two rooms or 2 grades in a classroom. And in fact, during that expansion, there were at times 3 grades in a classroom until they were able to probably get to that 15 kids per teacher sort of a rate, at which point they could add another called worker. So they're currently at about 75 students K-8. They have another 60 or so in their preschool. And maybe another thing to note is that these preschools, as Phil just explained, aren't necessarily income generating. And that's the same case for them. They use that as a feeder program. So the upper grades are there to help supplement the preschool, to feed them back into the upper grades where, you can all of a sudden get that higher kids per classroom ratio. One of the things that we kind of passed over is that the reason why we can't get to that 15 kids per classroom in the preschools is due to state licensure rules. We're limited to 10, so it's impossible to get to 15 kids in a classroom per teacher anyway. Once you add the 8 in, then you've got to add more students, right? So now we've got to get up to 18, 19 kids per classroom in order for a preschool to be sustainable. All right, and then just another just obvious effect of it is they've added families to the church. So they've gone from a 200-member church over the last 15 years to a 280-member church. They've also added 30% more Sunday attendance. So here's an example right out of the Wells yearbook showing that their expansion. You kind of see all those zeros down there, and then in the column you see their growth rate, right? So they started at a level, and actually this doesn't go all the way back to the beginning. The Wells yearbook only goes back 15 years, and they started a couple years before that. But they started at levels that weren't too far off from already with our kindergarten, right? They've got 7 in their kindergarten, 6, 4, 3 in their upper grades. And then you just kind of see as those grades, as they added kids to the bottom of that chart, and as those smaller classes rolled off from the beginning, I mean, 75 is a wonderful size school. And again, this is K-8. So some of the key findings out of that study, and again, we've got the interview with Pastor Klatt recorded. If you have any interest in spending 2.5 hours of your time watching it, it was fantastic. Really appreciated his input. But again, similar congregational size and circumstances. Shoot, did I miss my? Oh, they got put in the wrong order. Got to jump ahead. One page ahead was a demographic comparison and geographic comparison. One thing to note in terms of population, it's like, oh, they have a 10-mile radius. Well, they hit Minneapolis with their 10 miles, right? So they gain all of that. The odds that they've got too many members coming from Minneapolis out to New Hope are probably pretty slim. We get the refinery and the garbage dumps, which I believe have a population of 0 in our 10-mile radius. At least I hope they have a population of 0. The 5-mile population is probably a little more representative. And then the school comparison too. We're right in the center of this. You don't see a lot like within close proximity. You go to the middle of theirs, and within that 5-mile radius, there's all kinds of schools much closer to them than I think we can make the case. Than we would say is the case for us. All right, so back to the findings. So it's a congregation in a similar situation, or worth a similar situation than we were. I think you can call their school successful with a very steady enrollment. And again, if you were to look at that enrollment page and figure out if they're hitting 15 kids per classroom, they generally are. If not, they're very close. Our area demographics are similar. In fact, I could make the case ours is more favorable. We are in an area with higher incomes. And then they had those large building projects to get there. And I would say, again, for the most part, we've already accomplished that, right? The gym is already there. Those classrooms are already there, at least to start with, right? And then as we see that, should the school have success, then we can reevaluate and see where to go from there.
Yeah, and just so it doesn't seem like, oh, we have a comp and everything is good and this is a clear path. There's lots that we learned from that interview and that case study about the challenges that they had and the challenges that would be for us, as far as the amount of time and energy with volunteers from members, the amount of strain that this put on their pastor and the amount of hours that he was putting in. There was a lot of times when they said, financially, is this really? And they had to reassess and kind of re-look through these things. So this was not, and we're not using this as an example to say, well, this is a guarantee. We know that there's still a whole lot of prayerful consideration and trust in God's providence within all this. And this doesn't, this isn't the playbook that guarantees the outcome. But last thing I'm going to take you through are just oversimplified kind of what are the options that we considered and the positives and or negatives of each one. So the first option, which I don't think I have heard from many people as far as a real strong interest in, we should just close the school and no longer have any Christian education within a Lutheran elementary school model. But what would be the arguments for that? This, in theory, would be the most financially conservative option. There is no impact and no subsidy that would be needed from the congregation. We could rest assured that we're not going to have negative budgets if we do not have a school. And it would also potentially increase opportunities where we could rent the property for other purposes, potentially partner with other schools, and as we already do for some of the rental facilities. Arguments against that: obviously this is eliminating Christian elementary as a part of any of Heritage's ministry, eliminates that school-based interaction with families in the community. I think more often than not, outreach, and when we have surveyed, we want to be actively involved in our community with outreach and ministry, and this would eliminate one part of that. Also would be potentially challenging if we chose this option as far as our called staff and our teachers' aides and kind of just what would that look like as far as ending employment with staff and a potential negative community image. Option number 2, maintaining essentially what we have this year, preschool only. Arguments for that: no changes to the current programming. It is not, a significant change that our culture here at Heritage would have to get used to. We're already recognized in the community for our excellence within a preschool grade, and countless accounts that we heard from families regarding the excellence of our preschool program. Preschool and kindergarten. And it's also, argument for that, this is somewhat comfortable, it's convenient. This we could maintain the status quo without necessarily straining too much at all. Arguments against the preschool only: there is a high level of enrollment turnover. Obviously, we're recruiting a new class every year. That does cause some strain on the staff to be able to continue to market to new families. And it is the shortest amount of time that we have to witness and minister to those families while they're being served, if we only have them and capture kind of only the 1 year with them. And will, underscored by Phil, always negatively impact the budget. Preschool and kindergarten resumes the great offerings that we're known for in the community, an argument for that. Community recognition, again, of our excellence in this area. Still a high level of enrollment turnover. We still would need to call a third teacher for the kindergarten. Very limited as far as the budgetary impact because of the student retention issue, and does not appear to minimize the budget subsidy areas. Preschool through 5th grade. So essentially this model would bring students here in-house all the way up to the point where they could transition into an area middle school like St. Croix. This does allow for long-term grade expansion, more opportunities for student retention, again, lengthening the amount of time that we have to minister to families. If we did attain the enrollment, there's a pretty significant and positive budgetary impact if we did have students all the way up through 5th grade. Offers parents that full elementary education option outside of the public school from Heritage and then into St. Croix, and builds and leverages on the positive impact that we already have within our existing school. Arguments for this model, there's a lot of changes that would need to be made to the property regarding playgrounds, multi-grade classroom flexibility, increased costs for curriculum and for capital classroom changes. We would not be able to offer preschool through 5th grade in our current building the way it is. We would have to change some significant things. And there would be, with grade levels up to 5th grade, that we did hear from our others, and we would recognize that there would probably be need for even more administrative staff. So there's going to be additional salary costs associated with that model. So that brings to option 5, preschool through 2nd grade. This does allow for grade expansion, so we have more opportunity to serve students and families over a longer period of time without a capital expense. Increases that student retention for multiple years, increased length of opportunity, and it does have a positive budgetary impact. You saw Phil's analysis as far as the timing to break even, and the timing both on the long-term financial forecast. And arguments against it there is some kind of level of comfortability that internally and for the families that we serve for that multi-grade classroom and kind of their understanding of what that would look like. Some baseline costs for curriculum, and potentially leaves parents unsettled with not knowing kind of where after 2nd grade. So, next steps. We got about 2 or 3 minutes left here. I think, Dave, you were going to handle these next steps, but Phil, did you have some other commentary?
Yeah, just one other financial consideration for you guys to think about as you ponder this. I actually also just recently took a look at kind of the history of Heritage's cash balance and our kind of ability to do some type of expansion and handle capital investment. Currently, and a lot of this is because of the ERTC funds that we just got in, but we have over $200,000 of cash on hand now. This is the most plentiful time that we've had, at least in the last decade, of cash on hand, and $32,000 of that $200,000 is specifically earmarked for school-related reserves. So this is as good a time as ever to consider changes here.
All right, so you've seen the whole presentation, and so now the question is, well, what's next? And so what we really want you to do is I want you to go home, take those pamphlets with you, study them, do your own research. What did we get wrong? If you can identify something that's blatant, feed it back to us, right? And give us an opportunity to address it. And so you can do that 3 different ways. So if you want to talk to the committee specifically, this first group, HLC-Ed-Subcom, it's real clear. But it's also in your notes. It's printed there up for you. Feel free to email us and we'll respond back to you specifically. And then we'll also, through the listserv, we're going to create a little, kind of like our newsletter website, which will list all the questions that get asked and then the answers from council. And so, yeah, feel free to submit them to any of those 3 addresses. We'll all make sure they get to the right spot, and those questions will be answered via that way. And I guess another thing is make sure you discuss amongst yourselves, right? This is a presentation that was put together by a select few. We tried to incorporate as many as we could, but we didn't poll everybody. I guess the survey did, but we didn't talk to everybody specifically. So talk amongst yourselves and talk to those maybe that are maybe not here or that are a little less represented. And then, of course, after all of that, pray for guidance for that vote that's going to come up in 3 weeks. So on October 8th, we're going to meet again. After there's been, so what we're going to do is we're going to give you 2 weeks, and I should put this in the slide, but 2 weeks from today is when we're kind of close that question and answer period. So send all your questions within the next 2 weeks. At that point, and the reason is we don't want questions coming in the night before, the vote with urgent, or we don't want you to hold off on your questions until we want adequate time to respond to them. And so then on the 8th, then we'll, or I guess in that week in between, we'll make sure all those questions get answered. And then October 8th, we'll meet again. At that point, we kind of have to take, again, of those 5 options, unless someone else proposes an additional one that's even better, I'd like to have a vote on something similar to the final slide. And again, this is an example. And as you kind of probably gathered from the presentation, this is the way the ad hoc was probably leaning. And so the proposal is this, or the resolution would be this, right? Whereas we're electing to proceed with an option, the main point is that if we choose to go forward with an option with a kindergarten or K through 2 or K through 5, there is urgency in timing. And so out of this next meeting is effectively the command to the council to come up with a call list so that we can restart kindergarten the following fall. Okay. All right, I think that is it. We are long past or
Yes,
overdue.
we should conclude. We do have to get to second service. I appreciate everyone sitting through all of that. Again, we want any of the questions or information that you have, we want you to be well informed as far as what the committee looked at. And obviously, as a community, we are hoping to come together with understanding what God's will is for the future of heritage and education here. So thank you for your time this morning. I don't know if we are not doing any questions right now.
Yeah, I don't think we have time.
Yeah.
We blew it.
We'll have more time. There will be more open forum discussion
And, yeah,
before a vote in 2 weeks.
Find any of us in the hallway or email or phone call, whatever. Thank you.